Good evening. We're looking at the importance of the holy lands of the Bible, and right now we're in Egypt. It's taking a while because Egypt is mentioned almost as many times in Scripture as Jerusalem is. And just like Jerusalem, its importance is not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament. The first time we encounter it is when Abraham and Sarah flee to Egypt to escape the famine in the area of Canaan. And we have two occasions of Abraham asking his wife to lie and say that she's really his sister. Now, this happens because she is so beautiful that Abraham knows that the Pharaoh will want to marry her. And it's easier to kill Abraham than to try to work through a divorce. And so to save his own life, Abraham has his wife lie. But God hears about Sarah and rescues her from that situation. Now, the land of Egypt has some great blessings for the Hebrew people. It spares them every time that there's a famine, but we are now looking at one of the darker times of Egypt and the Hebrew people when they were enslaved there. Remember that Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, and he ended up being sold in Egypt. He would first be in Potiphar's household, but then he would be second in command to the Pharaoh. But after the time of Joseph, fast forward 400 years, and since all of his family had gone to live with him to escape the famine, you have the Hebrew people who have multiplied and grown in prosperity and numbers. And remember the famous one-liner, there arose a king in Egypt who didn't know Joseph. And so this Pharaoh enslaved the Hebrews, and now God hears their cry and works to set them free. Let's start with Exodus chapter 1. Exodus 1, 15 through 22. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it's a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this, and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and are delivered before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, commanded the entire nation of people to slaughter all the infant male Hebrews after they were born. He enlisted all of the people in this evil command. Exodus 2, verses 1 through 4. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took to wife a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds at the river's brink. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now, this slide has a couple paintings of Moses' mother. I love the one on the left. It has his mother, who we're told her name of Jochebed. We're told that in Exodus chapter 6, Numbers 26. But it has Jochebed and Miriam looking at baby Moses, almost admiring him. You can see in their faces this love, but this worry about how they would protect him. Now, I also love the painting on the right, although I think the artist took some liberties. I can't imagine a Hebrew slave woman in ancient Egypt would have something either so low cut or so ornate, but the expression on her face I thought was very moving. Exodus chapter 2, verses 5 through 6. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and lo, the babe was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, for she said, "Because I drew him out of the water." Now here is one of the kindnesses of God. Moses' mother, Jochebed, put him in a basket on the Nile, and she did so in hopes of saving his life. She didn't know what would happen, but Pharaoh's daughter took him out of the water and knew that this was one of the Hebrew children. And Moses' mother thought she would obviously never see her son again, but she sacrificed her time with him so that her child would live. The kindness is that Miriam, remember, had followed along the riverbanks to see what would happen. And when the child was taken out of the water to Pharaoh's daughter, Miriam just happened to appear. I'm sure it took great courage, but she said, "Shall I fetch a woman to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter says, "Yes, go and do that." Well, Pharaoh's daughter tells Moses' mother, not only, "I need you to nurse this child for me and take care of him while he's a tiny infant, but I'll pay you wages to do that." And so Jochebed thought she wouldn't see her son again, but now as a slave woman, she's getting to raise her infant son, and she's getting paid to do so. Another fascinating thing that happens here is that in this chapter, you see how God uses these people. These would be used to save the life of Moses, but also because of Moses, to save the lives of all the Hebrew people. And so initially you have the two midwives, the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, who defied the orders of the Pharaoh, and they wouldn't kill the boy babies like they were told to. And so the Pharaoh brought these two slave women to stand before him. "Why did you disobey me?" And somehow they had this courage from God. And not only did they come up with a story, but they kind of took a little dig at the Egyptians by saying, well, the Hebrew women aren't like Egyptian women. They're strong and vigorous, and they have their babies before we can even get there. And because of their faithfulness, Shiphrah and Puah had families of their own. But not only that, they have legacies. We know their names, Shiphrah and Puah. The Pharaoh, who is in this story, who had this evil, terrible order, we don't know his name. He was a king of Egypt. We don't know which one. And then God used the mother of Moses, Jochebed, and she sacrificed her own connection with her son to spare the life of her child. And so she was willing to give him up just so that he could live. And God used Miriam, who was brave enough as a slave girl, the audacity of her to approach a princess. But God used her, her mother, and then God used the daughter of the Pharaoh. She knew her father, the king's order to kill all the male babies. But she defied that, just like the Hebrew midwives had done. She took pity on the child. She knew that it was a Hebrew slave child. She knew that it was a boy and destined, ordered by her father that it should be killed. Instead, she took pity on this child, meaning that she wanted it to live. And the other thing that I think is kind of a wink is that, so here's this Hebrew slave baby that kind of drifts to her bathing area. And as soon as she draws the baby up out of the water, lo and behold, a Hebrew slave girl appears and offers to find a nurse for the child. Well, who would be able to just nurse this child except another mother or the mother of this baby? And so I have a feeling that Pharaoh's daughter understood very clearly that this was this baby's mother, that she was sending him home to until he was of the age to be weaned. They all understood, and the daughter of Pharaoh took it upon herself as well. So you have a slave girl and 3 Hebrew slave women, Shiphrah, Puah, and Jochebed, and then an Egyptian princess, all being used by God to save the life of this little baby boy, Moses. Exodus chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, for she said, because I drew him out of the water. One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. Now, just a couple of things to point out. First, the Bible doesn't say anything about Moses' later childhood or teenage years. It goes straight from him being weaned from his biological mother, Jochebed, and then being taken in by the daughter of Pharaoh and given the name Moses. And then the very next sentence says that one day when Moses had grown up, and so it has this beginning story when he's an infant, and then when he was weaned and named, and then it jumps to the time that he was a grown man. The second thing is that Moses knew that he was Hebrew. It says that one day when he was kind of out and about, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. And he looked around, he was kind of checking to see if anybody would notice, and he killed the Egyptian. And so he knew his own identity that hadn't been kept from him. Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 through 14. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man that did the wrong, "Why did you strike your fellow?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." Exodus chapter 2, verse 15. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. Now, we don't know if this Pharaoh is the same one who had ordered the killing of all male Hebrew babies. It might have been. We don't know either way. It might have been tolerated for Moses as a Hebrew to be raised by the daughter of Pharaoh, but it certainly wasn't tolerated that Moses as a Hebrew killed an Egyptian. That would never be tolerated. And so the Pharaoh seeks Moses' lives. Now, Egypt is the Holy Land that rescued the Hebrew people from times of famine. And Moses would be used to rescue God's people. But it seems that Moses is now rejected by the people who adopted him. Pharaoh wants to kill him, and now he's rejected by his own people. I'm sure they did not appreciate him living in the lap of luxury and looking on, the phrase says, looking upon their burdens while he was walking around, while they were slaving away for the Pharaoh. And so he really was a person without a people. He wasn't Egyptian, and the Hebrews were rejecting him. And so he flees to Midian. Now, I want to remind you, do you remember who the Midianites were? Their connection. Let's look quickly at Genesis 37. This is the brothers of Joseph. They sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers heeded him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. The Midianites were the ones who bought Joseph and took him to Egypt, and now Moses is escaping to Midian. Let's look at Genesis 41, verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. Now, I've shared before that the ancient Egyptians had clean shaven faces, no mustaches or beards. The Hebrews and most of the people in Mesopotamia at that time had full beards. Now, when Joseph was sold into slavery, he ended up at Potiphar's house, did well until Potiphar's wife falsely accused him of trying to molest her, and so he was thrown in prison. And while he was there, he encountered two members of Pharaoh's household, the baker and the cupbearer. They each had dreams that Joseph was able to interpret because of God's work in his life. And when the cupbearer was restored to his position with the Pharaoh, after a couple years, he remembered that Joseph was able to interpret dreams. And so the Pharaoh summoned him to interpret dreams that he, the Pharaoh, had had. Before Joseph went to meet the Pharaoh, it says that he washed and shaved. Now, I'm sure that prison wasn't clean, and so the washing was definitely necessary. But shaving was also important because having a clean shaven face, they call it clean shaven for a reason. They felt that having a shaven face was a higher form of cleanliness at that time. And so he shaved his face to be clean before the Pharaoh, but he probably took it farther than that. The priests in ancient Egypt would shave their entire bodies. Sometimes it's hard to see, but you can look in ancient pictures and paintings and you can see that their eyebrows are painted on because they've shaved their head and either plucked or shaved their eyebrows. Now, Joseph probably did this because he was appearing as a priest to the Pharaoh. The priests were the ones who had connection. They took care of the gods and they had connection with the gods. And so Joseph is acting as an intermediary from the one true God to Pharaoh. And so he took on this role as a priest, and it's very likely that he shaved his whole body to live that role. But the other meaning of him shaving himself before appearing to the Pharaoh is this adoption of becoming an Egyptian. It would be why his brothers wouldn't recognize him. When the brothers and the family came from Canaan because of famine and they appeared before Joseph, they didn't recognize him. He was clean shaven. Very likely he could have been bald, no eyebrows, and so it was probably hard to recognize him. Now, as Joseph shaved and really took on this life as an Egyptian, Moses would have been clean shaven in the Pharaoh's household. He would have looked like an Egyptian. And when he killed the Egyptian who was beating up the Hebrew slave, when he ran off to Midian, while he was in Midian, he probably grew out his beard. And so the next time he would appear before the Pharaoh, he would have a full beard. And so he had been clean shaven as living the life of an Egyptian, but he would return embracing the Hebrew life. Now, an interesting side note, if you visit Egypt, although the Egyptians believe that it was better to have a clean shaven face, the pharaohs would put on a fake beard for kind of serious or holy occasions. They would tie this fake beard to affix it to their head. And you may remember the picture I showed you of the statue of Ramses II. And you see that he has a kind of that long rectangular beard. But if you look at the side of the face in the statue, you see there's a thin strap that is used to hold the beard to the face. So they wanted him in a beard, but they wanted it shown that it was a fake beard. I find that funny. Here is a statue representation of Hatshepsut. She was the first female pharaoh over Egypt, and she is also portrayed with a beard, and very likely when she was ruling at any kind of high formal ceremonies, she would have had her fake pharaoh beard tied to her face. Exodus 5, verses 1 and 2. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should heed his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." Moses and Aaron approached the Pharaoh and asked him to let the Hebrews go, and he refused. And God would send plagues to Egypt. Now, of course, God sending a plague sounds terrible. None of us would like to live in a time of plague. It's terrible right now with the pandemic. But I will take the pandemic over any of the 10 plagues of Egypt. The first plague was the blood in the Nile River. The second plague was a plague of frogs. I think that would be horrible. The third plague was one of gnats. Now, I'll never forget when I was in college, there was a small group of us, just 4 of us from our botany class, 3 students and the professor, and we took a trip to Mexico and we camped out across the country. And as I'm saying it now, it sounds horrific. I remember at the time thinking I was very worldly and I'm an adult and this is just fine, but I can't imagine either of my children doing this. And but nevertheless, we camped out across Mexico, and on one occasion, we were staying in tents in this little town on the Pacific coast. And anytime the breeze stopped, usually there was a light breeze, but anytime the breeze stopped, there would be these swarms of these like little gnats called no-see-ums, and they would just be thick in the air and they would bite you, and these tiny little things, it hurt when they bit you, and they'd get in your nose and eyes and mouth. And I remember thinking, I'm going to literally go crazy because of these little gnats. And so a plague of gnats, although they're tiny, that would be horrible. Then the next plague was of flies. I hate flies too. The 5th plague was of diseased animals, and then because of the disease, they died. And then there was a plague of boils that affected both livestock and humans. And then there was a plague of a terrible hailstorm that damaged the crops. After that, a plague of locusts that probably finished whatever crops were left over. The 9th plague was of darkness, as if the sun had been blotted out. And the 10th plague was the death of the firstborn. Now you think of those different plagues affecting different areas of human existence. And then you realize that the people in Egypt worshiped a multitude of gods. And each god kind of had their little corner, their section of life, of human life that they controlled, some area of human existence that they oversee. You look at the god Ra, he was God of the sun. Each day, Ra would travel across the sky in the form of the sun. Osiris was the god who was considered to be the first king of Egypt, but he was God over crops and vegetation. Isis was the goddess known by several different names, and she was the one who would control the yearly cycle of the Nile River. And there were other gods who controlled livestock, life, death, every different element of human existence. And so when you see the 10 plagues with that as a backdrop, you can see that God is not only working to save the Hebrew people from slavery, but God is reaching out to show the Egyptians that there is only one true God, a God who hears the cries of his people and works to save them from slavery. And the pharaohs at that time felt that they were living representations of God. They were God made manifest, and claiming that to the people, and then having the people kind of subjugate other persons, in this case, the Hebrews, as slaves. And so God was speaking to the Egyptians as much as God was speaking to the Hebrews over, there's only one God, and you are not to control other human life. There's only one God who is Lord over all. Today, let's give thanks to God the Father, the Lord and Creator of heaven and earth, to God the Son, who conquered sin and death on our behalf, and to God the Spirit, who resides with us so that we are never alone. God is with us. Thanks be to God. Amen. Thanks for joining me. I will see you again on Monday.